Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Before we begin, a small request. This podcast is created independently and offered for free. No ads, no sponsors from our end. It's a solo effort, digitally narrated by Holly to help share the workload. It's built with love and care. Each episode takes considerable time to research and edit, so it's engaging, ethical, and able to hold complexity. If you enjoy it, a positive review on iTunes would mean a lot. It really would. It helps others find the show and makes the effort feel worthwhile. Let's begin. Liberalism is not dying, but it is misfiring, misheard, and in many places misrecognized. Its institutions remain, but their resonance falters. Citizens comply, but without conviction. Markets function, but concentrate power. Policy arrives, but lands flat. What's missing isn't just legitimacy. It's design that breathes. This essay returns to ordoliberalism not as historical artifact, but as a living tradition built around a single radical proposition: freedom requires form. Born from the collapse of Weimar Germany and the wreckage of totalitarian rule, ordoliberal thinkers asked not how to unleash liberty, but how to structure the conditions under which it could endure. They understood that unbounded markets fragment society just as surely as authoritarian states crush it. Their response wasn't ideology. It was architecture, a constitutional ethic, a design commitment to balance and constraint, not control. Ordoliberalism emerged in the ruins of certainty. It was forged not by theorists chasing utopia, but by thinkers like Walter Eucken, Franz Bohm, and Wilhelm Röpke, who saw freedom collapse under its own illusions. They did not reject the market, but they refused to worship it. They did not champion the state, but they refused to dissolve it. What they sought was something rarer: institutions that could hold contradiction without being undone by it. Today, as liberal democracies strain under populist backlash, technocratic drift, and civic exhaustion, ordoliberalism offers something increasingly vital: a design ethic, a way to think structurally without becoming cold, a way to speak of order without abandoning care. It shows how power can be dispersed, how institutions can carry emotional weight, and how law can breathe if it's paced, felt, and humanly scaled. What follows is not a doctrinal defense or theoretical exegesis. It is a narrative built through tension between structure and freedom, rhythm and rule, silence and legitimacy. It draws from the explicit ideas and latent intuitions of a tradition that never promised purity, only endurance. And it opens with a question liberalism must ask again, urgently, unflinchingly: can we build an order that does not silence, but holds? Ordoliberalism believed the answer was yes. This essay listens for how. It reanimates the ordoliberal tradition, not as a policy manual or economic doctrine, but as a living architecture of ethical design. Rooted in the crises of the 1930s, ordoliberalism emerged from thinkers like Eucken, Bohm, Röpke, and Ristow, who sought to reconcile individual liberty with institutional durability. They asked not how to maximize freedom, but how to shape the preconditions for its survival through structures that could absorb pressure without collapsing into force. Ordoliberalism was born of collapse. Its architects watched liberalism erode not through oppression, but through erosion. They saw that market excess and political centralization were not opposites, but twins, each destabilizing in different registers. So they proposed a third posture: design as restraint, not repression. Law as pace, not only power. What I call breath was not their word, but my translation of Eucken's proportion and Lebensordnung, the ordering of life at a human scale. My language of care aligns with Röpke's insistence on dignity, Würde, and the social bonds that give law its moral weight. And rhythm, for them, meant what Eucken described as rules that guide without micromanaging, and what Röpke pleaded for in economic policy: pacing change so that communities can adapt without breaking. This ethic of form was not abstract. It took shape in competition policy designed to break up cartels and keep markets open, in independent regulatory bodies that could enforce rules beyond the reach of political whim, in monetary stability, guarded by a central bank as a constitutional anchor for economic life. Even their hesitations mattered. Some warned against welfare expansion so rapid or unbalanced that it could erode both fiscal discipline and the moral basis of shared responsibility. These were not cold instruments, but the hidden metronomes of a living order. Anti-cartel law was a way of keeping the air moving. Monetary stability was a way of holding the beat. Even caution in welfare design was less about austerity than about sustaining the tempo of trust. Rather than merely defining the tradition, this essay inhabits its tensions between rhythm and law, care and command, freedom and friction. These are not binary opposites to be resolved, but live contradictions to be held. That was ordoliberalism's deeper instinct, that design must be elastic enough to endure pluralism, yet firm enough to preserve cohesion. What emerges then is not a theoretical claim, but an effective insight that liberal democracies lose legitimacy not simply through policy failure, but through loss of attunement. A government may still function on paper, rules may still be followed, but the tone shifts, the room feels colder, citizens move through it not as participants but as guests. We notice when an institution stops breathing, not because something explodes, but because something disappears. Timing becomes off, language grows metallic, recognition fades. It is not the absence of law that signals breakdown, but its indifference. Not the failure to act, but the failure to feel. Ordoliberalism begins with breath, not as metaphor alone, but as infrastructure for proportion, dignity, and order of life. Röpke and Risto wrote of institutions not as inert enclosures, but as living membranes, conditions for mutual recognition, for civic presence, for sustainable disagreement. Their fear was not chaos, it was airlessness, the suffocating tempo of orders that no longer hear their subjects. They addressed this fear with tangible safeguards. Competition law was written to keep markets open, and cartels dismantled before they could harden into private empires. Independent regulators stood as buffers against partisan capture. Monetary stability, defended by a strong central bank, served as a constitutional constant, a beat against which the rest of the economy could keep time. Even in social policy, some argued for caution, not a rejection of welfare, but a measured expansion that preserved both fiscal balance and the moral basis of mutual responsibility. These were more than technical fixes. They were the metronomes of a living order. Anti-cartel enforcement kept economic air circulating. Stable currency kept the beat steady enough for planning, investment, and trust. Welfare restraint was not indifference, but a pacing mechanism, ensuring that solidarity could endure rather than burn out. The ordoliberal insight was that design must be elastic enough to absorb the pluralism of a democratic society, yet structured enough to hold it together. It was not constraint as confinement, but scaffolding as care. A form designed not to control movement, but to sustain it, to carry contradiction without snapping. That kind of scaffolding holds friction without collapsing into force. It lets rules act without flattening. It gives law the time to be heard. And it protects not just against domination, but against disconnection, because freedom does not thrive in a vacuum. It requires form that adjusts, bends, and responds. It requires timing that feels like recognition, not imposition. But breath is fragile. Today, in many liberal democracies, institutions gasp. They function, but do not resonate. Policy accelerates past public comprehension. Civic life is proceduralized. Technocratic language muffles symbolic space. The citizen is reduced to input. Participation becomes response. Not shared construction, but managed compliance. It is not apathy, it is mismatch. A tempo out of tune with the people it claims to serve. This is not merely a governance failure, it is an effective breakdown. Exhaustion is not just psychological, it is structural. When systems are built without room to listen, people stop speaking, not because they have nothing to say, but because the silence feels mutual. This was the failure ordoliberalism feared most, the quiet disappearance of civic life beneath functioning machinery. Ordoliberalism did not promise perfection, but it insisted on design that could carry moral weight. Institutions, not just as rule makers, but as tone setters, is here, between structure and recognition, that the tradition still breathes. Ordoliberalism saw this coming. Its answer wasn't to abandon order, but to humanize it, to build legal structures that carry emotional weight, to treat rhythm not as inefficiency, but as fidelity to life. What's often forgotten in liberal theory is that order isn't what suppresses life, it's what makes it possible when shaped with care. Not as hierarchy, not as control, but as the spacing that allows for movement without collapse. So yes, institutions breathe, or they don't. We often realize it only when the air changes. When a rule arrives without room for objection, when a decision lands before meaning can catch up. The architecture still stands, but the citizen has no place in it. The system speaks, but not in a tone anyone recognizes. The effect is not rage, it is estrangement. Freedom needs scaffolding. It is one of the most misread truths in modern liberalism, misread by those who take freedom to mean absence, withdrawal, or the unshackling of power. But ordoliberalism understood something older, that freedom is not what remains when the state retreats. It is what emerges when public form is crafted to protect the space in which people can shape, resist, and sustain their autonomy. Without that structure, freedom doesn't expand. It collapses into domination, into fragmentation, into silence. The ordoliberals came to this not from theory, but from wreckage. They had watched markets consolidate into monopoly. They had seen law emptied of legitimacy. They had lived through the unraveling of social order into fascism. Their response was not to romanticize the past, but to design against its failures. The economy for them was not a self-correcting equilibrium. It was a system to be bounded by law, by norm, by deliberate design. Scaffolding meant structure, yes, but also restraint, laws to prevent concentration, norms to enable trust, a strong state not to command but to hold the perimeter, protective, visible and revisable. This was not technocracy dressed as ethics. It was ethics rendered structural, because freedom without form is not freedom, it is exposure, vulnerability, the moment when power unannounced and unaccountable takes hold in the name of spontaneity. But scaffolding is not only about restraint. It is also about elevation. A well-formed legal structure does more than limit abuse. It creates room for agency to unfold. A society shaped only by constraint cannot grow. One shaped only by spontaneity cannot cohere. Ordoliberals like Risto insisted that non-market institutions, families, schools, religious communities, civic associations, were as vital as competition law or monetary policy, because people do not become citizens by entering a market. They become citizens through formation, by being recognized, challenged, and situated in spaces where freedom is practiced, not presumed. This insight has grown more urgent, not less. In liberal democracies that equate autonomy with consumer choice, the formative function of institutions has weakened. Surveillance markets know our habits better than our governments know our names. Algorithms respond faster than courts. The public sphere is no longer where judgment is developed. It's where judgment is performed. And the scaffolding that once buffered private life from systemic force is eroding. Still, ordoliberalism remains fragile. Its emphasis on structure can be misread as rigidity, as managerialism, as nostalgia. Its commitment to form can be caricatured as elitism. But that is to confuse architecture with authoritarianism. The scaffolding it proposed was never about command. It was about containment, pace, and correction. It was about holding the plural tensions of a democratic society long enough that meaning might form and reform over time. What ordoliberalism offers, then, is not a blueprint, but a tension. Not a system to implement, but a structure to navigate. Its insight was not that order fixes the world, but that it holds it tentatively, conditionally, with humility. That holding is not weakness. It is the only way freedom survives, because where nothing is held, nothing can be sustained, and where freedom is left to float, it too eventually sinks. Care cannot be commanded. It is not a function of intention, institutional mission, or legislative scope. It cannot be drafted into a white paper or embedded in a metrics dashboard. And yet without care, without the felt sense that systems recognize, hold, and make room for human dignity, the liberal order begins to dissolve. This is the ordoliberal insight too often overlooked. That design without recognition becomes alienation. That legitimacy is not an abstraction, it is relational. Beneath the surface of ordoliberal structuralism ran a deeper intuition. Dignity precedes efficiency. The durability of law, the force of regulation, the authority of the state, all are hollow without ethical tone. A rule is followed because it is fair or because it is feared. Only one of those sustains legitimacy. And legitimacy, once lost, is not restored by procedure. It is restored by presence. This was the quiet genius of ordoliberalism, not in its economic models, but in its attentiveness to form as moral condition. The state, in this view, is not merely a supplier of order, but a shaper of ethical atmosphere. Its strength lies not in assertion, but in listening design. Its durability lies in responsiveness. The institutions that endure are not those that command loyalty, but those that allow people to feel seen in the rules they follow. In liberal democracies today, that recognition is fraying. Rules exist, but they no longer feel mutual. Citizens obey, but the ground beneath them shifts. They encounter systems not as shared structure, but as opaque mechanism. The interface replaces the encounter. Participation becomes procedural, not personal. And when dissent is met not with listening, but with protocol, when alienation is answered by dashboards and flowcharts, the signal is clear. The system is running, but it no longer knows how to care. This is not a matter of bad intention. Most systems are designed by those who mean well. But ordoliberalism reminds us, intention is not structure. Structure is what allows care to appear. And without it, intention vanishes into process. What ordoliberalism offered at its best was a commitment to institutional humility. It assumed that no structure would ever be final, no rule immune to revision. Power, in this view, must be dispersed not just to prevent abuse, but to acknowledge fragility. People are not stable inputs. They are temporal, emotional, interpretive. They live through language, memory, and contradiction. And systems built without space for those textures will ultimately harden into indifference. The care we speak of is not sentimentality. It is not softness. It is precision. The precision to design systems that can hold disagreement without rupture, that can administer rules without effacing those subject to them. Care cannot be commanded, but it can be built for. And this is where ordoliberalism still matters, not as dogma or template, but as a design ethic, a way of constructing public order that does not presume consensus, but makes space for negotiation. A framework where recognition is not occasional, but infrastructural, where law becomes more than compliance, becomes memory, breath, form. This requires institutions that understand rhythm, because when systems lose rhythm, they lose more than coordination. They lose intelligibility. They lose music. Rules without rhythm become silence, not the stillness of rest, but the hollow quiet of something that no longer listens. A system can pass laws, issue directives, enforce protocols, and still be dead to the world it claims to serve. Ordoliberalism never reduced governance to rules. Its architects had watched Weimar's collapse. They had seen how both markets and mandates could be weaponized. They understood that law must not only be just, it must arrive in time, in tune, with space to be heard. A democracy without intervals becomes a performance without breath. A liberalism without rhythm becomes a machine. Today, the machinery of liberal governance often outpaces its own intelligibility. Global crises demand velocity. Market fluctuations justify urgency. Institutions adapt by accelerating, releasing reforms, statements, actions before meaning can catch up. But rhythm is not a luxury. It is a precondition, not for efficiency, but for digestion, for understanding, for shared legitimacy. When the tempo fractures, comprehension fails. And when comprehension fails, trust dissolves. A referendum called too quickly feels imposed. A policy pushed without time for deliberation feels hollow. Even just rules fall flat if delivered without pause. Citizens disengage, not out of hostility, but out of exhaustion. They do not withdraw from politics because they expect perfection. They withdraw because the system no longer hears at the speed they speak. The result is not rebellion, it is depletion. Not outrage, but drift. People show up to vote, but no longer to hope. They comply, but do not believe. And what often gets labelled as apathy is something deeper, a mismatch of rhythm, a break in the shared tempo that once allowed institutions to feel inhabited, responsive, alive. Ordoliberalism offers a different register. It does not fetishize slowness, it does not romanticize friction, but it understands that law must be heard to hold, that rhythm is not inefficiency, but a form of ethical alignment. Timing is what allows institutions to metabolize contradiction without suppressing it. It is not the speed of policy that signals strength. It is the attunement of policy to the texture of public life. To govern is not only to act, it is to pace, not delay for its own sake, but pause with purpose. Because in that pause, something else returns. Meaning, trust, co-creation. And once that is gone, no amount of acceleration can bring it back. Breath is not the opposite of action. It is what allows action to land.